Precious said, I'm a Hazlitt Fellow with Foundation for Economic Education, and I've got some examples here that I want to go over that are from fee. And so let's start by taking a look at today's fee daily. So I wasn't planning on talking about this. This literally came into my mailbox this morning, and it just struck me as a really good example of some things that I actually would never myself write. And I'm going to talk a lot today about writing and my opinions on writing. I'm extremely opinionated. I have very strong views on what makes for good writing. And you might not agree with everything. And there might be instances in which what I say, I wouldn't agree with either. There are exceptions and certain contexts in which we have to take into account certain things that I might not be here. But in any case, this struck me as a really good example of something that I wouldn't do or publish. And so does everyone have the Fee Daily up, or would it be helpful if I share my screen? All right. I'm going to take that as yes, no issues, but if you don't have this up, it's going to be hard to follow along, and I'm happy to share my screen with it up if that would be helpful. So let me know. I'm just going to read this because it's really short, and I want you to be thinking while I'm reading this of what maybe is wrong with this. What about this could be better? Okay, Cynthia says, please share screen. So I'm going to do that. All right. Now you should be able to see that. Do you have it, Cynthia? Anyone else want to unmute and tell me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. All right. So this email starts out, good morning. Due to a shortage, Japan is now having to import rice from South Korea. While Japanese consumers have tended to be skeptical of foreign rice, the global trade network means it's nonetheless possible for importers to buy from other rice-growing nations when there is limited domestic supply. Imports can change local cuisines, too. Japanese diners were once very wary of uncooked salmon because Pacific salmon tended to carry parasites. It took one enterprising Norwegian firm in the 1980s to convince Japan to import their Atlantic salmon and use it for sushi. It's now the most popular sushi fish in Japan, and demand continues to grow. A joint venture between Japanese and Norwegian firms is even farming salmon in Japan. That's the kind of synergy that comes with international trade. Here at FEE, we're also talking about food, with Daphne Posadas' piece on Mexican government's attempt to police people's diets. Okay, don't be shy. Share your thoughts. What might I and what might you think that this email could do better, presuming that the point of this is to, in some way, shape, or form, promote the ideas of liberty and, in the case of fee, free markets. I see that there are some messages in the chat. Okay, those don't pertain to this. But if you have thoughts on these questions, please don't just leave them in the chat because I might not see them. Just FYI, it's hard for me to keep an eye on that at all times. So let me add a little bit more specificity to my question. Who am I? And why am I getting this email? Does that spark any thoughts about what might not be right about this? Everybody there? Just to verify that you're awake, I know you are, and I know you're paying attention. It's a hard question, but just tell me the very first thing that comes to mind for you about this email. Please don't be shy. We won't get very far if nobody wants to speak up, because we need to have lots of interaction in today's. There we go. So I see some hands raised. It looks like Doris was first, but going forward, don't even bother to raise your hand unless we run into an issue. Just unmute and speak up, and then we'll deal with, people speaking over each other if that becomes an issue. Go ahead, Doris. I'm not hearing you just yet. All right, perhaps there's a microphone issue. I also can't see you, so I don't know if you're trying to speak yet or what's going on.
Maybe I can go next as Doris tries to figure out. Cynthia Omondi is my name. I'm joining in from Kenya. For me, I think I'll sort of focus on the second paragraph, which doesn't really sit well with me. Imports can change local cuisine too. Japanese dinners were once very wary of uncooked salmon because, especially the part in quotes, because Pacific salmons tended to carry parasites. I don't think that is a very good way of conveying message. So to me, I think, yeah, that paragraph doesn't really sound well regarding the local cuisine in Japanese, and maybe for those people, those in that business, that wouldn't sit so well with them. So yeah, it is not very well conveyed, and it doesn't portray Japanese very well.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. All right, other thoughts? Doris, you want to go now if you've got your mic sorted out? Who is this? Anybody can answer this question. Who is going to be concerned about Japan importing rice from South Korea? Who cares? Now, I'm not asking as a. I'm not. Go ahead, Cynthia.
The rice farmers would be concerned. Those who are.
I'm sorry, you're coming through a little bit more muffled now than you were a minute ago. I couldn't make that out.
So I'm saying that the rice farmers in Japan would be concerned.
Yeah, sure. Or maybe Japanese citizens, or maybe Japanese restaurants.
Yes.
This isn't to promote the idea that at all that only America matters or something, but I'm an American in America, and the first line of this email is, due to a shortage, Japan is now having to import rice from South Korea. And this whole email is about something that should concern the Japanese who are eating this rice. But why is this pitched to me? Why do I care about this? The simple answer is that I really don't. I don't see a connection to my life or my values. And it's not that there isn't one. It's that whatever the connection between this and me, the reader, is completely unstated. So it doesn't impact me or affect me, at least from what's on the page. This doesn't matter to me in my life. It's not important. And this is an example that really illustrates the necessity of thinking very, very carefully about who your audience is, who you're speaking to, and what those people care about. And there are different ways that you could write about this very topic and not, in essence, forget who your audience is. So, but let's look back now at the Google Doc I shared a minute ago. I'll share it again in the chat, but I'm also gonna, I guess I'll continue sharing my screen just in case you're on a device that doesn't make it easy. But I would make sure to copy and paste the link that I just dropped in into some sort of note or something where you can reference it again. Make sure that you have access to it, because this contains 3 big ideas that I want to share today that hopefully you'll walk away with and be able to immediately start using. And I want to actually, as much as possible, make today a workshop to actually do some work today to demonstrate how we can put ideas immediately into practice. So there are some examples up here at the top. Let's talk briefly about this thing called the U rule. It's really simple, but really powerful. This is a rule that comes from marketing copywriting, and there are all sorts of practices that people use in marketing that are extremely important for writers in general to know about and to leverage when it makes sense to. The U rule is really simple. Make it all about you, the reader. And that means really knowing who your reader is and what your reader cares about. A good test for being able to do this is to be able to draft your piece using the word you as much as possible. Okay? And it might be the case that you're writing for a newspaper or a magazine in which ultimately using the you pronoun doesn't really work for their style guide. That's fine. You can adapt and talk about, for instance, Japanese consumers or American consumers, which is kind of a lame bucket because everybody's a consumer in some way, shape, or form. But you can change you to other things. But the point is that if you think about it in terms of you, the reader, what you care about, you'll be able to hone your message in such a way to make it actually useful and interesting to the person that you're actually attempting to address. So let's take another international story then. This was something that I wrote for Fee. And this is an article that, much like the email that we just read, although that's just an email, not a full article, much like that, it's focused on something that doesn't necessarily directly impact the people that I'm writing to, or it's not necessarily immediately clear how it could be important to them. But I took it seriously. I'm not trying to toot my own horn by using examples from my own writing. I can also go through my own writing and find examples of the thing that I'm telling you not to do. So this is a hard-won lesson. It's something that I've had to learn by doing it wrong. But the reason I use examples from my own writing when I can is because it's easy for me to remember what I've written and to find those articles and use them as examples. So that's what I do. That's why I do that. So like Katrina in the email that we just read, I wanted to write about something that was happening in another country, in a case where it may not have been very obvious what the impact was or the value was for an audience that I was directly addressing. So I found a way to make the thing happening elsewhere to someone else serve as a lesson to the people that I wanted to address. And I think that comes across like that promise is made, the promise of the value for you, the reader, which in this case is primarily an American audience, that promise is made right in the title and the subtitle here. So I'll just read those two. Brazil is proving that there's no such thing as unbiased censorship. Now, I think the meatiest part of the promise comes in the subtitle. As Americans sift through the Twitter files and learn the shocking truth about US government involvement in social media moderation, they can take important lessons from Brazil's recent foray into censorship. So I've taken something that in itself, if I were just writing about the news of what happened in Brazil, would not matter. Nobody would care. My reader, it would be an example of what I just showed you. It'd be an example of not speaking to you, the reader, and appealing to you at your values. But I found a way to connect this topic to my reader and to my reader's values. And I can't stress enough how important yet often overlooked this single, simple thing is. People generally, writers of all sorts, not just those writing in defense of freedom, but I think those that want to write in defense of freedom are particularly guilty of this. It's, I have an idea. I have an ideal freedom. I know the truth about this. I want to share that with as many people as possible. But articles that do that, that don't really take into account what it is that the reader cares about, fail to actually change anyone's thinking about government, about politics, about rights, because probably the vast majority of those articles are never read or read by a very, very small portion of people, because they're not framed in a way that connects to the life and values of the person that you're writing to. So how do you do that? How do you think in terms of what your reader cares about? It's pretty, I would say I put this filter on when I'm thinking about a topic. So suppose we're thinking about the fish market or the rice market in Japan. What rational, legitimate value does my reader have that this topic connects to? So if I were trying, and I haven't thought about this in advance, so I'm not even sure if I'll be able to do this, but to try to use this as an example of what we might have done differently if we were writing or editing that little email there. What rational value can I connect what's happening over here to what rational value can I appeal to that connects to what's happening over in Japan right now? Well, I don't know the full history, so I have to kind of go off the cuff here. It sounds like mostly what has happened there has been cultural. It hasn't been laws. It hasn't been law related. And the value that Katrina gets around to talking about is the value of free trade there toward the end. That's a really big and important topic all over the world right now, because we in the US are a huge player on the global market, and Trump, of course, is threatening and imposing all sorts of tariffs left, right, and center. And this email oddly doesn't really talk about that at all. The thing that kind of, is the most relevant, most top of mind topic that relates to that, this email doesn't touch on. Now, there might be reasons for that. Maybe, they have very strict orders not to piss off, certain fundraisers who happen to be, donors who happen to be Trump supporters or something. There could be legitimate reasons for that. There could be less legitimate reasons for that. But you as a journalist should try as much as possible not to bow to that sort of thing. And also, just for the point of the example here, it would make way more sense if you're writing for any audience, but particularly this is FEE, so it's written for an American audience, to talk about how this connects to, or is an example of, or what lesson we can derive from it for an American context, for whatever context you're writing for. Now, if you're writing about this in Africa, then you have to think about, okay, who is my reader? Why might they care about this? How could I frame this in such a way that it actually does matter to them? Maybe it's just a lesson that we can take from abroad, or maybe it's more direct. Maybe there is some impact on the rice that we buy here and the availability and prices and things like that. But long story short, the U rule is incredibly important, and I highly recommend that while you're initially thinking about your topic, that you sit down and think about it in terms of what legitimate value does my reader have that I can appeal to and connect this to. If you're, a lot of times we think about, at least in the US context, we think about the political left, people that want to push us toward socialism or to bigger government, to broader redistribution, wealth redistribution programs and things like that. And we think of the average person supporting these things as somehow like evil, and they just want these socialist policies, and that's it. And it's my job as the writer in defense of liberty to be like this knight in shining armor that comes through and just knocks the nonsense out of these people through the sheer force of my logic, so to speak. And actually, if you actually think about the people that you're writing to, it might just be, for instance, a single mom who really wants her child to get a good education, who thinks that the best way for her child to get a good education is to have more government funding of education, have greater government involvement in education. When you, as the advocate of liberty, know full well that actually the more government is involved in education, the less the quality of that education and the more the problems there are with education. And so you can appeal to that rational value. Well, if you really want your son or daughter to get the best possible education, then actually you don't want greater government involvement. You don't want more money for schools. What you want is for government to get out of education entirely, to leave education to the private market, because on a private market and on a free market, people compete and customers win. Now that's, we're simplifying here a lot, and there are all sorts of counter arguments to this idea that you have to go through. But the point is, we're looking at what the reader actually values, in this case, a great education for their child, and pointing to the ways in which freedom makes that value way more reachable. So that's the U rule. Let me pause and find out if you guys have any questions so far. I saw some, come in just a minute ago, and I think that the way that the Zoom chat works is that you don't get the links if you come in late. So let me drop that in again. And whoever's hosting this on the Liberalist Center side, I think that is you, Precious. If you don't mind to grab this link and occasionally drop it in from time to time, that would be helpful too, especially because I can't find the chat now. I'm gonna have to stop my screen share to find it.
Oh, no problem. I'll get back to you.
Here's that link again. All right. So any questions so far on this, I think, pretty simple idea, the U rule, and how to use it? Maybe, I'd love to hear any pushback that you have. Perhaps some of you write for places where you think that this might be hard. There might be certain ways that you might run into issues trying to use this, anything like that. Everybody is happy. Everybody is quiet. Precious says, please unmute if you have questions. Yes, please do. I definitely prefer that over dropping them in the chat. See, there is some worries about people not being able to hear me. Hopefully that's just a connection issue on your end, and that I'm coming through clearly for 99% of you. Definitely stop me
Hi,
if we have
Jonathan.
a
Can you hear
connection
me?
issue. Yep, got you, Fortune. Go ahead.
Yeah, good. I think I'm enjoying the session. This would, I think this would sync more with the print guys. I'm a broadcast journalist. My question would be, how do you apply that on a space like a radio station? How do you apply that? Talking to people,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in concrete, what literally do you say? I can't, script a show. But what I can say is that this rule applies in every medium. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you want to make an Instagram reel, if you want to write an op-ed, if you want to do a radio broadcast, if you want to get up and give a speech in your town, think about who you're talking to and what they care about. It's really simple. So if I were doing a radio broadcast on tariffs, I would probably try to find, I would look for ways to indicate why it matters to the people that I'm talking to. So for instance, do you have plenty of money and you're okay, like you have no needs whatsoever, or are you having a hard time affording certain things that you need already? Are you ready for the prices of the things that you really need and rely on to go up, in some cases more than 100%? Or do you work for a company that imports pieces, components for your manufacturing process? Do you work for a company that imports components from Canada, Mexico, China, India, you name it? And what's going to happen to your company if it has to pay X amount more for those components because of tariffs? And what's going to happen to your company and your market share if consumers in those other countries have to pay much more, 15, 20, 100%, 145% more for the products that you make? Is that going to impact your ability and to compete, your company's ability to compete? Is that going to potentially lead to some firings at your company? Are you going to have a job in a year from now? If these things happen, if we go forth with tariffs like this, these are all serious worries that might directly impact you, dear listener, you, dear reader, whatever the case might be. But you get the point. I'm talking to my audience and thinking in terms of what my audience values. I'm not getting on and saying Japan has to import rice from South Korea. I don't want to overstate the problem with that, but I think it is pretty big. I'm not trying to pick on that too much, but it's just a very clear example of what I'm talking about. And it came out this morning and stuff like that. It's not at all uncommon. So it's not even a coincidence necessarily that that's what I got today while I was sort of preparing for this session, because you see people write like that all the time. And it's not just in the liberty movement. But does that answer your question, Fortune?
Yeah, it's fine. I think my point is you must try to understand these values, however small, so that your audience can also pick the pieces. Because if you're relating to them, it also means you have an understanding of what you're talking about. For example, the world is talking about the Pope today. A lot of people are not Catholics. A lot of people do stuff, but they kind of relate to, from the fundamentals of terrestrial media, they kind of understand how big it is, why the entire world is talking about the Pope. So if I'm to relate it in my article, to interest someone who doesn't know about the Catholic Church or the Pope. So I kind of get your point.
Yeah. And you have to think about at the state, like when you're thinking about what you're going to write, you should already be thinking about who you're writing for and where you intend to publish. All of these things are interconnected. The audience, the publication, whether that's your own personal Substack or it's a newspaper or magazine or it's a radio show, whatever the case might be, you're thinking about your audience while you're forming your story, and you're forming your story in conjunction with what you know about what your audience cares about. And if you have the opportunity, if you're a freelance writer like me, there are certain things that I would write about in certain venues that I wouldn't write about in others. So for instance, if I really wanted to write a longer, more in-depth piece about censorship in Brazil, maybe I should pitch it to a publication in Brazil. Maybe I should pitch it to the readers that will most be impacted by it. Another common sort of mistake that I've made, but I see all the time, is, and it's a version of what we're talking about, not applying the U rule. It's to write to, for instance, what Donald Trump, what Vladimir Putin should do, or what Lula in Brazil should do, as if I'm talking to Lula or as if I'm talking to Putin. Like, I'm going to tell you a lesson, Putin. But Putin's not reading what I'm writing. I mean, unless I'm very, very either lucky or already have a massive audience and am hugely influential, it's very unlikely that the dictator that I'm writing to is reading my piece. So if I pitch it, if I write it in such a way that he is my target audience, I'm completely disconnected from my actual audience. But you see that kind of thing all the time. And again, it's a mistake that I've made. I've had to learn this the hard way, is that it doesn't make sense to write to somebody who isn't actually reading your work. Write to the people who, write to your target audience, should be a broad swath of people, in a way that appeals to their values while talking about the topic that you care about. Okay, so, but I want to immediately try to put this into practice. So Fortune brought up writing about the Pope. If you could, type into the chat something that you're either currently in the process of writing about or something that you would like to write about, maybe the piece that you're thinking about writing next. And let's look back, before you do that, let's look back at this document that I shared earlier and quickly introduce what I'm calling the 1x3 method. Now, this is just a means, and there are many different means of doing this, but this is one means of going from idea to execution very fast. What matters as much as anything is your timing. You could have the smartest argument, the best ideas, the best examples, but if it comes out a week after the world cares about it, it doesn't really matter. So as powerful advocates of liberty, you have to be in tune with the rhythm of the conversation that's actually happening around you. And you have to be able to speak on things from a pro-liberty perspective very quickly. And a great way to do that is, of course, using X, what used to be Twitter. And I've framed this method in terms of X or Twitter because, you know, so many people are on it, and it's a really, even if you don't like it, I personally don't like it. I tend not to use it that much. Even if you don't like it, it's still a really useful tool for writers because it can help you test your ideas in short form with very little investment of time and energy. It can help you test those ideas, see what resonates with the most people, hone your messaging, and go from there. So it's kind of, you can kind of think of it like market testing that manufacturers do with customers before releasing a product. So I used to work for a pet product manufacturer, and they would create, like, for instance, we created a feeder that you could control, like a dog feeder that you could control from your iPhone or from your Android phone, so that if you're away, for long periods of time during the day, and you want to make sure that your pet gets fed at a certain time, you can go on your phone, press a button, and the meal will drop. The dog will hear the food come into the bowl. He'll run over and eat it. Now, before they released this product, they sat down with customers, gave them a phone with the app on it, and said, go ahead, use it, see how it works, see what you like about it, see what you don't like about it. In essence, give us immediate feedback on this thing before we go through the process of launching it to the rest of the world, of putting all this marketing behind it, and finding out that there's some fatal flaw that requires us to rethink this whole project, which would be a very expensive mistake. So this writing on X is a great way to do market research for writers. It's a great way to quickly get some sort of MVP, as they call it, minimum viable product, launch that product or test that product with people, find out what sort of response you get, take that information, go back to the drawing board, try again and again, and then to take that, all of what you learn, and put it into an article. But setting aside the idea of using Twitter or X as a market feedback mechanism, this method, whether you're on Twitter or not, still works. And you could use the same thing if you want to create an Instagram reel, or if you just want to do it on a piece of paper in your bedroom and not share it with anyone. This is still a great method for getting the gears turning and doing more timely writing in defense of liberty. And I want to actually try to do this here on the call. Obviously, we can't unmute and hear from everybody here. So what we'll do instead is, I want you, as I talk about these things and tell you to do them, I want you to do them and then drop your results into the chat. Don't worry about spelling, grammar. Just try to hone the ideas as best you can in a very short amount of time. The idea is to do this very quickly so that we can talk about these things, not for the purposes of embarrassing anyone, but just looking for lessons that we can pull from how people are doing with this. Okay. So step one of this 1x3 method, I call it 1x3 because there are 3 steps to it. Actually, steps 2 and 3 have 3 sub steps to them. Step 1 just has 1 step. So 1x3, perhaps I'll come up with a more clever name at some point, but that's what I'm calling it for now. Okay, so write 1 sentence, and it could be a 1-sentence tweet or post, whatever they call it now, defending a pro-liberty position. And I want you to keep in mind what we just talked about with the U rule. So one tip here, at least when you're thinking about this and how to frame your position, it's often a good idea to formulate it as follows. If we want X rational value, if we want, cheaper prices on the market, if we want better education for our kids, if we want whatever rational value we're talking about here, then we must why. And why, let's just talk about real quick, why frame it like this? An alternative would just be to say, we must get rid of tariffs. Okay, but why? Oh, we just must. That sort of framing doesn't speak to, and it doesn't put you in the mindset of speaking to your reader and what your reader cares about. So the point of framing it like this, if we want X, then we must Y, is that you make it what's called a hypothetical imperative. And all that means is an if-then statement. And that if-then statement is focused on what your reader cares about, what your audience cares about. Okay, so take a minute. Maybe let's take 2 minutes. We'll go to, we'll go to, yeah, can I? No, I can't use that. We'll go to 11:46 a.m. my time, so it's a little bit more than 2 minutes. Write one sentence in an "if we want X, then we must Y" format, speaking to some pro-liberty position, like laying out some pro-liberty position. Go. I'm going to try to do it too. I'll try to do this with you. One minute left. And time. Okay. What time is it? 46. Okay. All right, great. I'm seeing some of you have already dropped in your statements, and some of these are really good. Thank you. Please continue dropping those in, and just give us the best of what you're able to do in that very, very short amount of time. Okay, so Lawrence said, if we want economic progress in Africa, we need more trade within the continent and not foreign aid. Good. If we want our democracy to thrive, we must insist on freedom of the press. From Abby, thank you. If we want freedom, we must speak about ourselves. From Asha. Please rephrase the question again. Sorry, Petra, but it was to do exactly as we're seeing here in the chat, to formulate an if-then statement speaking to the values of your reader about some pro-liberty position. So there are lots of good examples in here about essentially what you want to try to do. All right, so Sani said, if we want a peaceful Nigeria, then we must understand and value our differences. If we want to stop prison congestion, says Zainab, then we must address the constitutional provisions that enable them. If you want freedom, you must speak for yourself. If we want freedom, then we must be allowed to choose our path. Okay, there's lots of good answers here, and there's also lots to talk about in some of these answers. So I'm going to basically pick at random to see what we can pull from some of these. Okay, if we want economic progress in Africa, that was the first one I read from Lawrence. And I really like this one because who doesn't want economic progress? And who in Africa doesn't want economic progress? Probably no one. Like, no one's going to stand up and say, I'm against economic progress. That would just be stupid, right? So you've picked a really good value to appeal to here. And you know, you're spotlighting that value, a value that presumably your reader cares about. Now, if you're doing this in article form, maybe you start your article with that, but maybe you come up with, and we'll talk about ways to come up with methods for spotlighting that isn't just that. Let's go to another one. If we want freedom, we could pick any of these other ones that start with if we want freedom. Now, the issue there, it's kind of like the economic progress, but it's a little bit elusive because freedom has a definite objective meaning. Yet, it's a fact that in common usage, when people use the word freedom, just like when people use the word individual rights or the phrase individual rights, they can mean vastly different things. I'm just looking at the time here. Can someone remind me, are we going until 1/2 the hour, or are we supposed to end in about 10 minutes?
Okay, we're supposed to end about 10 minutes.
Okay, then we need to fly. But I actually am happy to stay a little bit longer if anyone else has the time to, and especially if you have questions or things you want to discuss. I'm happy to do that. I'd planned to stay till 1/2. So with the freedom example, at one level it's good because no one's going to stand up and say I don't want freedom, but socialists, for instance, will stand up and say, well, we have to be free from the dictates of powerful employers who get to set the terms of employment contracts or something. Meaning we need to socialize property to put control of that into the hands of government, which of course is not a pro-freedom policy at all. But the point is that the enemies of freedom often appeal to the same values as the proponents of freedom. They say, if we want freedom, we must X. If we want to protect rights, we must X. And then they'll say, well, but you have a right to a fair wage. You have a right to a job. You have a right to a home. You have a right to healthcare. They completely poison the concept of rights and of freedom in order to try to make their positions sound more agreeable. Okay, so thank you for doing that. The next couple steps, we won't really have time to go through here on the call, but I want you to do them.
Sorry, John, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, so you can spend 10 more minutes, so that makes it 20 minutes extra.
Oh, so 10 more minutes would be 20 minutes extra?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So looking back at the sheet, and again, like copy the link from this, and you can even share it with other friends or people that are writers, whoever you'd like, feel free to. The next step of the 1x3 method is to write 3 more sentences like the one you just wrote. And you can even use the if-then formulation if you want, if that's applicable here, but you don't have to. The point is to write 3 more of those, just single, concise statements that further explain your position. So if we go back to Lawrence's, for instance, let me find it here in the chat. Lawrence wrote, if we want economic progress in Africa, we need more trade within the continent and not foreign aid. So at least 2 things that you need to address there are, why not foreign aid? Like, we need an explainer on that. The reader who doesn't already know what you're talking about, in order to be convinced, needs some explanation of that point. So why not foreign aid? So, Lawrence, draft another point. You don't have to do the second, but draft another point about why not foreign aid. And just a single sentence. It could be something like, foreign aid doesn't stimulate growth, but instead actually impedes it, for instance. Or you could put it in the if-then formulation. To the extent people get free aid, they aren't incentivized to go out into the world and create projects and companies that can give them sustainable forms of income. So we have a point about that. Then we have a point about trade within the continent. Well, that's an interesting point. Why not trade, with other countries? So you need another point, at least one more point about that, right? Now, I've given you here also some examples, and you don't have to go with these, but they can be really helpful. if you're having trouble thinking about why and how to explain your point. So those are, you could have a point about the problem. So like the social problem we face. What is that problem? And not only what is the problem, but what is the common big government solution? Now, Lawrence has packed those into that initial statement already. He said that the problem is that we need more economic progress, and the big government solution, quote unquote, that actually isn't a solution is to try to get more foreign aid, right? The consequences of that, that's the second point that we were just talking about. The consequences of more foreign aid is that people aren't incentivized to go out into the world and create the things that actually enable long-term sustainable growth, that enable profits. And the alternative, and the principle behind that alternative, is to simply step out of the market, right? The alternative is free trade, enable people to, start their businesses with like very minimal barriers to entry. You don't want things like you have to have a mandatory license to cut hair or to install drywall or to do landscaping. It's like stupid barriers to trade that keep people from entering the market and competing with other people and driving prices down and, pushing the whole market forward. And then what's the principle behind that? And you'll find in almost every case when we're talking about an economic issue, it's the principle of individual rights, which we'll get to in a second. So if you've done this, you've written that one sentence and then you write 3 more, then we get to step 3, flesh that out. But everything that we've talked about so far, you could simply make that a tweet thread if you wanted to, and see what sort of interaction you get from people and whether or not you think that the story that you're developing has real legs and is interesting to readers. But step 3, if you want to turn this into a full-fledged article or a podcast or a radio show, whatever it is, then flesh it out. And that is what you're doing here. Take your most important point that you've written, the most interesting point rather. What's the most interesting thing that you have on the table at this point? And figure out how to put that thing first. Doesn't matter where it is in your writing so far. Figure out, how can I put that thing first and introduce it in such a way and flow the article in such a way that that isn't some sort of speed bump or it doesn't seem illogical. And then you logically order the other points that you've just written, add examples, data, and supporting arguments as needed, and add a summarizing ending point as needed. And if you do these things, then you have an article, or you have a radio show, or you have, an Instagram reel or something, whatever medium you're working with. But this is a quick step to go from idea to execution. And the reason that, I'm stressing that today is because a lot of people, especially when they're starting out, just spend too much time in research and thinking. And by the time they get around to actually writing something, like their moment has passed, the story is no longer, died on the shelf, so to speak. This last point, which we don't have much time for, is use rights to take the moral high ground. If somebody thinks that something is practical but not moral, they're not going to do it. If they think that, for instance, in the US, anti-price gouging laws, which are price controls on certain types of groceries and things that are intended to help people afford like milk and chicken and eggs and things like that, especially during a pandemic, for instance, that those things are moral. So even if they're not practical, even if they cause shortages, we're not going to get rid of them, because if we did, then people would be even more food insecure, quote unquote. And so they wouldn't have what they need. So the people who are pro big government in this case take the moral high ground by saying, well, we need to make sure that those who are worse off have what they need to survive. And in so doing, they take the moral high ground, and it's hard for an advocate of liberty to answer that. But in almost every case, an advocate of liberty can easily answer this by taking them back the moral high ground and talking about rights. Rights are not granted by God. They're not granted by government, although these are common views. And even if you hold the idea that rights are granted by God, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe that, then your argument is dead in the water. So I think even if you hold that, you have to also think about what other ways you can talk about rights that will appeal to somebody who doesn't hold that. And the quick and dirty answer that I can only spend a couple minutes here on is that rights are principles that identify facts about human nature and sanction our ability to act on those facts. So the facts are that to create the values that sustain our lives, food, water, shelter, all the things that we need to live, medical care, transportation, everything in the supermarket, to create those values, the things that we need to survive, we have to be able to think and then act on our judgment. That's how human beings, by and large, that's how human beings survive. That's our essential means of survival. It's different from other animals that act on their instincts to go out into the wilderness and attack another animal and eat it, or to find an acorn and bury it underground and come back to it 5 months later, whatever the case might be. We don't have that. The way that we survive is by using our minds to create values. The only thing that can keep us from acting on our judgment to both create and use those values is when somebody else initiates force against us. So in order to be able to live as human beings, to be able to live as our nature demands that we do, we need government to remove the initiation of force from social relationships. So that's government's sole legitimate responsibility. Now, you might not be convinced of this. There might be much more that I would need to say even to make this idea clear. I would say if you're not versed in this view, if it seems completely foreign to you, I would highly recommend checking out What is Capitalism, an essay by Ayn Rand that I should have linked here, but I didn't. Maybe somebody can quickly Google it and drop a link in. But What is Capitalism? I think it's available in speech form by Ayn Rand from a lecture that she gave at some point. There is also one called Man's Rights and another called The Nature of Government, all by Ayn Rand, that I think are really valuable arguments to have in your toolbox, so to speak, in order to be able to take the moral high ground and defend rights. And lastly, because I know we're over time now, I want to continue to be a resource for you guys. And the best ways to do that are for you to subscribe to my Substack, to email me, or to reach out to me on X. So this is all the information to do that here at the bottom. I've also included a writing tool that if you're writing especially a longer form article or even a book, this can be a really helpful tool for thinking about the sorts of questions that you need to answer to effectively move your reader from wherever he is right now to being more persuaded of your position. And then lastly, I'm including here a fee article formula that was given to me while I was doing a program at FEE. I'm a Hazlitt Fellow there, and while I was more actively taking part in the fellowship, when I first started it, they gave me this article formula, and I think it's really good. If you go through this formula and use the prompts that it asks for, it'll often prompt you to fill in holes in your ideas and your argument that you might not have thought of, that will strengthen it and help you turn out good articles more consistently. So thank you for your time and attention, and sorry the end of this was a bit more rushed, but probably the most important point nonetheless is the one that we spent the most time on, which is really taking seriously the you rule and thinking about it in terms of your audience, what your audience cares about. If you do that one thing, you'll be ahead of something like 95% of writers that are trying to write to promote freedom. So thank you so much, guys. And I can hang around for a while to answer questions, of course.
Thank you so much, John. That was amazing. All right, so fellows, if you have questions, please, it's time. You can just unmute yourself and ask your questions. And if you don't want to use the mic, you can always drop it in the chat room. So I would give like 1 or 2 minutes to see if we have anyone who has questions. So, fellows, once again, in case if you can't hear me clearly, this is the time to ask your questions. Everything you want to know about writing powerfully in defense of liberty. We've learned about the U rule, the 1 times 3 method, and how to use the right to take the moral ground. So, if you have your questions, please, let's do that right now. And of course, he already gave you the access that you can subscribe to his Substack, and you can reach out to him too. But let's make this interactive.
And if you don't have questions, because everything was just so incredibly clear, a valid question would be something like, can you say a little bit more about X? There are certain things that we only spent a very short amount of time on, so happy to talk more about anything like that. Yeah, Doris, my email address is in the doc. Let me grab it again. So resources at the bottom, there's a link to my Substack, to my Twitter profile so I actually didn't say this. I guess I'll steal another minute since I'm not seeing any hands yet. I'm in the process of launching a completely new project. I've talked to Abdullah about this. This is something I'm independently developing, but I'm also talking to people at Students for Liberty about. And it's going to be a writing course, a sort of masterclass taught not just by me, but by several really high-profile, successful writers in the liberty movement. Some of them are constitutional lawyers, some are magazine editors, some are longtime voices in the movement that have published scores and just loads of books, New York Times bestsellers, things like that. And it's going to be basically a series of modules with high-level lessons that you can take from these writers and apply to any form of communication, whether you're actually writing op-eds or doing radio shows or, whatever medium you're working with, you'll be able to use this. And if you want more information on that project, because it's brand new, I'm literally talking about it publicly right now for the very first time. The only or the best way right now to do that is to sign up for the Substack, because I'll be making announcements there. And then secondarily, follow me on the X account that I literally just set up for this project this morning. If you email me, I'll do my best to keep track of all of those and keep you posted. And what I might even do if you email me is take your email and subscribe you to the Substack so you can get the updates for this project, which I hope will be, much talked about in the circles that you guys are swimming in here. So you'll hear about it. But if you want to make sure that you do, no better way than to subscribe to me on one of these channels.
Okay, Sharon, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for sharing it with us for the first time. Yeah, we're lucky. So, fellows, make sure you sign up to your Substack account. So, I presume there's no question. So, I would be using this opportunity to thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much for this interactive session. In fact, my paper right now is literally filled up. Yeah. And I'm very sure that all fellows also have their hands on tech. So we can't wait to write about more of how to write powerfully, yes, in defense of liberty.